Welcome to the Hidden Corners, where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur, as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind. Tonight on the Hidden Corners, we have two more short ghost stories by Payne Brennan. The stories are The Midnight Bus and In the Very Stones. I hope you'll enjoy them. The Midnight Bus. Old Mrs. Twining was telling a story about imported marmalade for the third time that evening when Martha glanced at her watch. "Oh my goodness," she exclaimed, "I really must be off. If I don't hurry, I'll miss the last bus." Assuring her elderly hostess that she had had a most enjoyable evening, she wriggled into her coat, scurried into the vestibule, and was soon off the veranda steps and down the garden walk. Mrs. Twining was an old dear, but she was tedious at times, Martha thought, as she swung open the gate and stepped onto the sidewalk. Goodness, here it was almost midnight, and Mrs. Twining was going on about marmalade for the third time. Lucky she'd looked at her watch. She had rushed out in such a hurry, she was well down the walk before she noticed the fog. Rising from the nearby river, it was thickening in the empty streets. The lights looked dim and far away. The whole suburb seemed muffled and silent. Shivering a little, Martha reached the bus stop and sat down on the cold bench. Glancing along the street, she saw that it was quite empty. The river fog was swirling in rapidly, and now even the trunks of trees were becoming blurred and half shadowy. It was too bad, Martha thought, that people had to become old and lonely and hungry for talk, leading such dreary, uneventful lives that a little thing like imported marmalade assumed vast importance. She hadn't been out to see old Mrs. Twining for over a year, and the poor dear would have kept on talking till morning if Martha hadn't broken away to catch the midnight bus back to town. Martha sighed, drawing her coat a little closer. She did wish the bus would hurry along. The bench began to feel like a carved slab of ice, and the fog was getting so thick she could scarcely see across the street. It was just after 12 by her watch when she saw a faint light flicker through the fog. It was a very feeble light, and it approached with maddening deliberation. It appeared to just creep along, as if the driver of the vehicle were groping his way down a totally unfamiliar route. When the bus stopped in front of the bench, she saw that one of its headlights was quite dead, and the other did not look very bright. As she stepped up into the bus and dropped her coin, she intended telling the driver about the single headlight, but she didn't. The driver thrust a ticket at her without turning his head, and for some reason, which she didn't at the moment grasp, her impulse to speak vanished. She walked back to the middle of the bus and sat down. The bus rolled forward again. Glancing out, she could see nothing but fog. It pressed against the windows like a white wall. It even seemed to be seeping into the bus. The seat felt as cold as the bench back at the curb stop. For some reason, she kept looking at the driver, perhaps because there wasn't much else to look at. About all she could see of him was his back. He sat slumped in the seat, hunched over the wheel, looking to neither left nor right, his total attention focused on the fog-blurred ribbon of road immediately ahead. Martha wished there were some other passengers on the bus. The driver was no company at all, and the smothering fog outside made everything seem so desolate. The interior of the bus itself looked dingy and soiled, as if it hadn't been swept out or polished for months on end. Frowning toward the window, Martha realized that she would never be able to tell when they were approaching her destination. The fog had become an impenetrable blanket, swirling close on all sides. "Driver," Martha called out, "will you please stop at Barley Street?" He didn't answer, didn't turn, didn't so much as nod his head. He stared forward into the fog, and Martha imagined that he hadn't even heard her. But of course he must have. It was simply that the fog made driving hazardous, and his entire attention was concentrated on the street ahead. Trying to stifle her irritation, Martha leaned her head back against the seat and attempted to relax, but the top of the seat was hard and cold, and she soon sat up straight again. She suddenly realized that she was shivering. She must be catching cold, but the bus did seem frigid. She could scarcely keep her teeth from chattering. And now a new vexation caught her attention. In spite of the almost opaque wall of fog, the bus driver was steadily increasing the speed of his vehicle. The bus careened along at a constantly accelerated rate, bumping and lurching and swaying from side to side. Martha felt a funny little knot of fear and apprehension begin to tighten in her breast. For a block or two she held tight to her seat, stifling an urge to shout at the driver, but finally she could stand it no longer. "Driver!" she called out in a strained voice which didn't sound at all like her own. "You're going much too fast. Won't you please slow down?" As if in response, and without paying her any other heed, the driver managed a new and positively fearful burst of speed. The bus thundered ahead until the fog seemed to be going by in white streamers of light. Fighting back rising hysteria, Martha stood up. "Driver, please! We'll all be killed!" Martha felt deadly fear coil up within her. The man was either drunk or mad, and she sensed at once that any further attempt to reason with him would be futile. Clutching the seat handles, she began stumbling toward the front of the bus. At least she would be near the door, she decided, when, if, something happened. Once a sudden lurch of the bus almost threw her off her feet. Clutching the back of a seat, she regained her balance and staggered ahead. She could no longer force back the panic which was welling within her. She felt, or rather she knew, that her life was in danger. And when she finally reached the front of the bus and stared ahead into the fog, it was impossible to retain any lingering doubts about the lethal jeopardy of her position. The vehicle's single headlight had gone out. The bus was racing through the midnight fog in total darkness. With a scream, Martha turned toward the driver. He sat with a fixed stare, grimly intent, entirely oblivious to everything except the white wall of fog looming up immediately ahead. With the scream still on her lips, Martha whirled toward the door. It opened. Or perhaps it had been open. She was too terrified to know, but in any case, there was the cold white fog streaming past outside. She hesitated momentarily. It took courage to hurl herself into that rushing white wall, not knowing exactly what lay beyond it, beneath it, or within it. But some sure instinct warned her that there was no choice. This fearful, icy bus, racing ahead into the foggy darkness without any lights, could come to only one end. With another wild scream, she plunged through the open door into the streamers of fog. For a second she was snatched through space in the wake of the midnight bus. Then she struck earth with a thud which seemed to loosen every bone in her body and went bouncing and rolling along the ground like a rag doll hurled aside by an angry child. She came to rest against a hedge and lay motionless, the taste of wet, moldy earth in her mouth. She was still lying there, wondering how many bones she had broken, when a rending crash sounded somewhere ahead in the foggy darkness. She heard the tinkle of falling splinters of glass, and then there was silence. Sudden, terrifying silence. The silence endured, pregnant and somehow horrifying, and she wanted to scream again, but her mouth was full of dirt, and screaming was difficult. A light appeared. Someone shouted, and she managed to groan. A face materialized out of the fog, a kindly, anxious face. The man bent over her. He spoke soothingly for a moment. He straightened up and called into the fog, "It's a girl. She's hurt. Bring a blanket, quickly." In less than a minute, a sturdy woman appeared. The two of them, the man and the woman, slid the blanket under Martha and lifted her up. In another minute she was carried out of the fog into a cozy, lighted house and tenderly laid on a couch. While the man telephoned for a doctor, the woman asked Martha where she was hurt the most. Martha wasn't sure. She was hurt all over, but not in any special place. The woman brought her a wet cloth, a glass, and a pitcher of water. After Martha had rinsed out her mouth, the woman gently washed her face. The man came into the room. "The doctor's coming right over. Now don't you worry." Martha sat up and carefully moved her legs. They felt bruised, but assuredly not broken, and she could move her arms without any concentrated pain. The man nodded. "Good. No bones broken, by the looks. You were lucky, child. You struck the turf outside, and not the hard cobbles." Martha suddenly remembered that splintering crash which had followed shortly after her frenzied leap from the speeding bus. "Oh, that poor man," she said. "Has anybody gone to help him?" They both looked at her. "What man, dear?" the woman asked. "The bus driver," Martha said. "That was such a horrible crash." They went on looking at her without saying anything. A queer uneasiness overcame her. "Didn't you hear it?" she asked. The man shook his head. "Well, we heard you scream, but we didn't hear any crash." "But there was," Martha explained. "The bus I jumped out of didn't have any lights, and it was speeding, and I heard it crash." They were looking at her strangely now, as if they didn't believe a word she was saying. "What bus did you jump out of?" the woman asked, laying a cool hand against Martha's forehead. "The midnight bus," Martha replied. "I was visiting a friend on Coverton Street. I got the last bus, the midnight bus, just after 12. The woman smiled gently. "The last bus on Coverton Street runs at 11. The midnight bus was discontinued a year ago. Nobody used it much, and then after the crash—" "What crash?" interrupted Martha, with an eerie feeling that she knew what the answer would be. "A year ago," the woman explained, "the driver of the Coverton Street midnight bus ran off the road into a wall and was instantly killed. It happened not far from here." Suddenly the woman turned pale. She stared at Martha. Remembering the cold, grim interior of the bus, the white face of the driver, and the one feeble headlight which had finally gone out, Martha felt an icy thrill of fear. She saw her bag lying on the couch, and she pointed to it. "My bus ticket," she told the woman, "is in there." When the woman drew out the bus ticket and held it up to the light, her pale face seemed drained of every drop of blood. She stared at her husband and then at Martha with round, frightened eyes. "I had forgotten," she said softly. "The date on your ticket reminds me. That crash was just a year ago tonight." In the very stones. It is inconceivable to me, wrote my psychic investigator friend Lucius Leffing, that any person of reasonable perception and sensitivity could pass a long period of his life in a specific habitation without leaving something of himself, impregnated, as it were, in the very stones, wood, and mortar of the place. How vividly I recalled this statement later on, but let me start at the beginning. I had been away from New Haven for many years, and I returned in a rather weary mood of reminiscence and regret. My health was not good. The rheumatic fever of my childhood had finally damaged my heart. In addition, I was having eye trouble. The optic nerves were unaccountably inflamed. Strong light was painful to me. In dim or subdued light, however, I could see remarkably well, so well, in fact, that I began to feel that my vision was becoming abnormal. After engaging a room in one of the few remaining residential areas of the city which had not been engulfed in the spreading contagion of human and social degeneration, I began to take long, rambling walks about the town. I usually waited for a day when the sun was hidden, when the sky was overcast, and the light was gray rather than gold. My eyes stopped throbbing, and I could stroll in relative peace. The city had changed remarkably. At times I scarcely knew where I was. Acres of familiar buildings had been swept away. Remembered streets had vanished. Great new structures, efficient but ugly, rose on every side. New highways looped and slashed in every direction. In bewilderment, I frequently retreated to the still unseized central common, or green as it is called. I understood, however, that even this last leafy refuge was under siege. Various interests were agitating to cover the grass with cement in order to create a gigantic pay-toll parking lot. One afternoon in late October, when a threat of rain hung in the air, I started out on a walk. The lack of sun rested my eyes. The chill air somehow soothed me. For an hour or so I strolled aimlessly. On a sudden whim, I decided to visit a city area which I had so far neglected. I had lived in this section as a very young child, over 40 years ago. Although I was scarcely more than 3 when the family moved, I retained vivid memories of the neighborhood and of the specific house itself. The house was a 2-story red brick structure, solidly built, located at 1248 State Street. When I lived there, a big elm tree stood in front of the house. In the rear, a large empty lot, which stretched to the adjacent street, Cedar Hill Avenue, made an ideal playground. Subsequently, the elm tree was cut down, the lot was nearly filled by a cheap tenement-type building, and the entire neighborhood declined. As I approached the old area, I was appalled at the appearance of things. Some houses had been torn down, others stood vacant, displaying smashed windows, broken doors, and collapsed verandas. On one block, every house was empty and partially wrecked. I was amazed and disconcerted. I had not seen such desolation since war days. Under those gray October skies, with a thin mist already starting to fall, it was the bleakest scene imaginable. I experienced an intense oppression of spirits, and as I continued to walk along those strangely deserted streets, my mood of dejection only deepened. I finally met a pedestrian, muffled already in a winter overcoat. He squinted at me suspiciously when I asked him why so many of the houses stood smashed and empty. "Route 91, he muttered, hurrying away. Although I had learned there was indeed a rational explanation for the devastation, I felt no better. I was firmly convinced that a slight alteration on the highway blueprints could have carried the new road across empty marsh flats, only a few miles away. The cost of fill would have been a fraction of that expended on extensive condemnation proceedings. I fully expected that the brick house of my early childhood lay already in ruins. I felt a thin exultation at finding it still standing. I say thin because of course I knew it was doomed. Already its windows were broken, its doors sagged in, and part of its front hedge had been ground away by truck or bulldozer. As I stood regarding it, remembering clearly episodes of over 40 years past, I reflected on the rootlessness which marks the average city denizen. By choice, or more likely necessity, he moves from one house to another. He has no anchor, nothing of continuity. When he visits his old neighborhood, he may find that his former house has vanished. The site of it may be occupied by a city-supported project for permanent welfare cases, or by a cinder-block garage, or by a barren parking lot. The houses, the trees, the backyard, the very curbstones and sidewalks may be gone. The returner will experience a haunting sense of loss, a sense of bewilderment, of chaos. He may finally begin to feel that he is even losing his own identity, that in fact he has no identity. He will feel lost in time, without either a future or a past. There will be nothing he can go back to, and nothing of permanence that he can foresee in an uncertain future. Isolated, fugacious, essentially a drifter, he will experience a loneliness of spirit which nothing can assuage. Thousands of his kind inhabit the modern city, gnawed by a sense of their own rootlessness, hungering in vain for a home, a habitation which partakes of the flavor of time, a continuing and cherished spot of earth which links their own past with some kind of hopeful future. With these depressing thoughts in mind, I stood before the lost red brick house of my childhood. I had an impulse to enter, but I supposed it was unsafe and very probably forbidden. Dusk fell. The mist grew heavier, and still I lingered in that area. Moving away from the doomed house I had known, I wandered along those desolate streets, peering through cracked windows, through sagging doors which never again would open to a friendly hand. In some windows, frayed, blackened curtains, left hanging in the confusion of forced removal, fluttered in the cold October wind. Odd bits of broken furniture, dishes, and ornaments lay scattered about. Entire lifetimes had been passed in some of these houses. Now they stood as empty shells, awaiting absolute and final destruction. The entire area seemed deserted, silent, drained of all life. Even the usual city noises were strangely muffled and distant. I roamed restlessly, numbed by the desolation which surrounded me, yet perversely unwilling to leave. The mist thickened and full darkness fell, and I remained. In spite of the darkness, I could see remarkably well. I linked this abnormal ability with my eyes' unusual sensitivity to strong light. I felt that both conditions stemmed from the inflamed state of the optic nerves, an affliction I have already mentioned. I passed an alley, glittering strangely with bits of scattered window glass, and stood surveying an adjacent house which leaned crazily with a collapsed roof. It was a small white frame house, inexpensively built, and yet I saw that someone had once tended it carefully. The paint was bright, the little mailbox looked as if it had been scrubbed, and the trampled remains of a once neat garden surrounded the place. I stared at this wrecked house through the growing mist. I saw a face at one of the two front ground-floor windows. It was the face of an old man, white, mournful, filled with an ineffable desolation. I gazed at it in astonishment. My first thought was that an elderly vagrant had crept into the wreckage of the white house in order to pass the night. The dampness, probably, made his old bones ache. The face continued to look out at me. I walked away with some uneasiness. I shivered, blaming it on the cold mist. I had gone less than a half a block when I saw the woman. Enormously fat, she sat in a wicker chair on the half-demolished veranda of a 2-story house. She wore very thick lensed glasses, which seemed to reflect light from some hidden source. There was no moon, certainly, and I saw no artificial lights nearby. I was startled, but I supposed that a few people might still be clinging illegally to old homes in the area, pending final arrangements for the occupancy of a new residence. Some impulse urged me to hurry past, to move straight ahead without looking aside. Stubbornly, however, and against my own best judgment, I refused. Instead, I paused, cleared my throat, and spoke. "Good evening," I said. The fat woman did not reply. She did not seem to have heard me. Possibly, I reasoned, in addition to having weak eyes, she was also hard of hearing. I moved a few steps up the front walk and nodded. "Good evening," I repeated loudly. Then I blinked in astonishment. The wicker chair was empty. I stopped dead and stared at it. Momentarily, I had glanced down at the walk to make sure that I would not stumble over debris. In those scant seconds, the fat woman must have vacated her chair and slipped inside. I marveled. For one of her bulk, she moved with amazing agility. Turning, I went back to the sidewalk and started on. I suppose that the woman was self-conscious about her continued occupancy in the condemned house, and had gone inside to avoid any necessity of discussing it with a stranger. As I walked away, I glanced back. Once again, I saw light glitter on those thick-lensed glasses. The fat woman was back in her wicker chair. Something more than the swirling mist made me shudder. Frowning, I hurried on. It was late, I told myself, and I'd better leave these ruined, mist-shrouded streets and go home to a good cup of hot tea. I walked rapidly, but I could not resist looking at the vacant houses I passed. Suddenly I stopped. My heart began pounding. An icy gush of fear made my scalp tingle. Wide-eyed, mouth agape, I gazed through that tenuous wall of mist and felt that reason and sanity were leaving me. Nearly half of those smashed and deserted houses all at once were occupied. I saw pale, sad faces peering from a dozen different windows. Dim, mist-circled figures sat on some of the porches. An old man, twisted with some arthritic malady, worked feebly in a tiny front garden. A middle-aged woman, white as death, but with a kind of hopeless fury stamped on her face, stood glaring near a broken gate. Worse than these were other sights. I saw a rocker moving to and fro on a porch, although there was no one in it. I saw a claw-like hand tapering to a vague sleeve, which in turn raveled away to nothingness, clutching the brick side of a building. In the rear garden of a half-destroyed house, I glimpsed what appeared to be the disembodied head of a woman in a big straw hat, drifting slowly above the matted tangle of a neglected flower plot. I felt the clutch of near madness. I no longer had any faint desire to linger and look. Flight, immediate and imperative, became my only object. I rushed wildly through those forsaken, yet not forsaken streets, with fear like a hound at my heels. I ran till my heart thumped and dizziness overcame me. At last, away from that accursed area of peering white faces, of clinging mist and strange pregnant silence, I collapsed in a doorway. Hours afterward, I reached home and fell into bed. For days I was ill. My heart had been strained anew, and in addition I manifested pleuritic symptoms. As I lay in bed, I brooded over my weird experience on that street of silent houses. I told myself that my eyes, inflamed and supersensitive, had played tricks on me, that the drifting fog plus my own imagination had been at fault. But weeks later, when I related my adventure to my psychic investigator friend, Lucius Leffing, he shook his head at my explanations. "I am firmly convinced," he told me, "that neither your inflamed eyes nor your imagination conjured up the phantoms which you describe. As I wrote you recently, it is inconceivable to me that any person of reasonable perception and sensitivity could pass a long period of his life in a specific habitation without leaving something of himself, impregnated, as it were, in the very stones, wood, and mortar of the place. What you saw were the psychic residues of the poor vanished souls who, in the aggregate, had spent hundreds of years in those condemned houses. Their psychic remnants were still clinging to the only earthly anchors that remained, and already, as you relate, some of them had dwindled and faded to mere detached fragments." He shook his head. "Poor souls."